The first thing I noticed about the building was that it had no name on the front. Not a logo, not a number above the entrance, not a polished brass plaque next to the revolving door. Just glass and dark steel, and the kind of silence that very expensive buildings maintain at 8 in the evening, when most of their occupants have gone home, and the few who remain are not the kind of people who want to advertise the fact. The address Vittoria had sent me was for the 50th floor. She had sent it 3 days after I had returned to Rome. 3 days after I had unpacked the only photograph I had kept from Capri. 3 days of not hearing from her. 3 days of having decided I was not going to hear from her. 3 days of standing very still, inside a decision I was not allowed to negotiate with anyone, including myself. Then a single message had arrived, on the private number she had given me on the morning of the 8th day. 3 lines. A friend of mine needs a photographer. She is particular. She does not let new people into her circle. I told her about you. The address is below. She is expecting you Thursday at 8 in the evening. Bring everything you would bring for a private portrait sitting. Be careful with her, Dahlia. She is more dangerous than I was. I had read the message 4 times, standing in my kitchen with the morning light coming through the window. I had read it once more in the afternoon. I had not replied. There was nothing in the message that asked for a reply. Vittoria was a woman who said things once and waited for the world to absorb them. If you want to hear the longer, uncensored version of this story, what happened in that office after midnight, the photograph she made me develop while she watched, the call I made to Vittoria at 3 in the morning that I cannot tell you about here. It's all on my Patreon. The link is in the description below. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The lobby of the building was the kind of empty that was not actually empty. 2 men in dark suits at a security desk who looked at me the way certain men look at women they have been told are coming and have decided in advance not to be visible about. One of them stood when I came in. He did not introduce himself. He said, "Miss Voss, 50th floor. The elevator on your left is keyed for it tonight. The other elevators will not stop on that floor." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Miss Reyes is expecting you." The name landed the way certain names land when you have been preparing yourself for one shape of evening and discover at the door that the shape is going to be something else entirely. I had not been told the name. Vittoria had not used it in the message. I had been told only that Vittoria's friend was particular and did not let new people into her circle. The name Reyes meant something. The name Reyes in the world Vittoria moved in meant a great deal. I had not put it together in my head until the security guard had said it out loud, but the moment he did, I understood what kind of evening I was about to walk into. I said, "Thank you," again. I do not know what else I could have said. The elevator was the kind of elevator that did not announce its movement. I stood inside it and watched the small number on the panel climb. The number went from 1 to 50 without stopping at any other floor. The elevator opened on a small reception area that had been built to be deliberate about the impression it made. Dark stone, a single low orchid in a black ceramic pot, 2 chairs that looked as if they had never been sat in. There was no receptionist. There was a woman at the far end of the room standing with her back to me, looking out of a wall of windows at the city below. She said without turning, "You are early." She said it with no accusation in it, the way certain people make observations to mark them rather than to weigh them. I said 8 minutes. She said, "I noticed." She turned then. She was 40 years old. Her hair was very dark and cut short, perhaps a centimeter above her shoulders, the kind of cut that had been done with the precision of a craftsman who had been doing only that for a very long time. She wore a charcoal suit cut so cleanly it appeared to have been built around her body rather than fitted to it. Black shirt underneath, 2 buttons open at the throat. No watch, no earrings, no ring, no necklace. The complete absence of jewelry on a woman in a suit of that price was, I understood immediately, a statement, not an oversight. It said, "I do not need to decorate myself. I am sufficient." She looked at me. Her eyes were very dark, very steady, the kind of eyes that did not move while they took inventory. She said, "Vittoria told me I would recognize you the moment you walked in. She was correct. Come." She turned and walked through a doorway at the far end of the reception area, and dimly lit. Soft lighting at the floor and ceiling. The rest of the space held in a deliberate dim warmth. The walls were dark wood. There were no doors except at the end. We walked in silence. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a person who had decided what the next 45 minutes were going to contain, and had no intention of negotiating the route to them. At the end of the corridor was a single door. Dark wood, brushed steel handle. She opened it without looking back at me. The room beyond was a private office. It had been built, I understood the moment I entered, by a person who had wanted a room that would not be like anyone else's office. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides showing the city at night, a long expanse of lights spreading to the horizon. The desk was glass and steel, set perpendicular to the windows so that whoever sat at it could choose whether to face the city or face the door. Right now, the chair behind it was empty. The work surface was clean, a single closed laptop, a glass of water, nothing else. To the right of the desk, against the only solid wall in the room, was a different kind of setup. A photographic backdrop in soft gray, two professional studio lights on stands, a stool, a small side table with a bottle of mineral water, and two glasses. It had been set up by someone who knew exactly what a portrait sitting required. It had been set up before I arrived. She closed the door behind us. She locked it. The lock was a small mechanical sound, not theatrical. The functional click of a person who locked doors as a matter of routine, the way other people checked windows or turned off lights. She said, "I do not want to be interrupted." I said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" I looked at her. She was standing perhaps 5 feet from me, with her hands at her sides. Her face was perfectly composed. Her eyes were doing the things certain people's eyes do when the rest of the body has been trained to be still, and the eyes are the only place the truth is allowed to live. I said, "I think I do. I am here for a private portrait sitting at 8 in the evening in your private office, which is on a floor of a building where the elevators have been keyed not to stop. The door is locked. We will not be interrupted. I do not believe you brought me here to photograph a corporate headshot for your website." The corner of her mouth moved by 0.5 millimeter. She said, "Vittoria warned me about you." I said, "What did she say?" She said that you would understand the situation faster than I expected. She said that you would not pretend to be confused. She said that if I wanted to play the game of ambiguous professional intent, I should hire someone else. I said, "She is correct." She said, "I know she is." She moved past me toward the photographic setup and paused at the stool. She did not sit on it. She stood beside it, with one hand on its back, and looked at me across the room. She said, "My name is Mara Reyes. I am the chief executive officer of an investment firm whose name you would recognize, and which I am not going to tell you, because the name does not matter for what we are doing tonight. What matters is that I have not let a stranger photograph me in 11 years. What matters is that Vittoria called me 3 days ago and told me about a photographer who had come to her villa to take pictures of the cliffs, and had ended up developing prints of her in the dress she had not worn since her husband died. What matters is that Vittoria does not recommend people. She has not recommended a person to me in the entire 15 years I have known her. What matters is that when she did, I cleared my Thursday. I said, "Mara?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What did Vittoria tell you exactly?" She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "She told me that you were the first person who had photographed her without flattering her. She told me that the first photograph you took of her was one you took without knowing you took it. She told me that on the 7th evening you handed her a picture of herself reading, and she told you she would keep it on the shelf above her bed. She told me that you wrote her a letter that she will not show to anyone, not even me." She paused. She said, "She also told me to be careful, because you would see things in me that I would prefer not to be seen, and because she did not want the friend she had spent 15 years protecting to be hurt by her own decision to recommend you." I said, "She is very protective of her friends." She said, "She is." I said, "So why did she recommend me?" A silence. She looked at the city through the windows. The lights of the city were doing what lights of cities do at night, indifferent and continuous. Then she looked back at me. She said, "Because I asked her to." She said, "Yes, 3 weeks ago, we had dinner at her villa for the first time since her husband died. She had not received guests at the villa in 11 years. She made an exception for me because we had something to discuss. We discussed it. At the end of the evening, when we were sitting on the upper terrace, I asked her how she had decided to come back. She said, "A photographer." I asked her, "What photographer?" "The kind of photographer you do not ask twice for." And I told her, in a voice I did not entirely mean to use, that I had not been seen by anyone in 11 years either, and that I would like to know the name of the photographer who could make a person decide to be seen again. I said, "And she gave you my name?" She said, "She gave me your number. She told me she would call you herself first, to prepare you. She told me to wait 3 days. I waited 3 days. Then she sent you the address." I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am here to take a photograph of you tonight." Vittoria did not tell me this part. But you have just told me the part that matters, which is that you have not been seen by anyone in 11 years, and that you would like to be seen tonight, by me, specifically, because Vittoria recommended me. I am willing to do this. I want you to understand before we begin that I am not going to flatter you. I am not going to soften you. I am not going to make you smaller than you are. The photographs I take of you tonight are going to look like you. If you do not want that, you should tell me now, and I will leave, and there will be no consequence between us, and Vittoria will be the only person who ever knew this conversation happened. She looked at me for a very long moment. She said, "I know you are not going to flatter me. That is why Vittoria sent you." I said, "Then we will begin when you are ready." I said, "Sit on the stool." She sat on the stool. I had been carrying my equipment bag at my side the whole time. I set it down on the floor beside the photographic setup. I unpacked the camera I had been using for 15 years, the camera that had been around my neck the day I had walked into Vittoria's villa 6 weeks ago, the camera that knew how to do this work better than I did. I lifted it. I looked at her through the viewfinder. She did not pose. She did not adjust her face. She did not arrange her hands. She looked directly at the lens with the same composed certainty she had used to lock the door. I took the first frame. I lowered the camera. I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. If you cannot answer it honestly, I want you to tell me that, and we will continue without the answer." She said, "Ask." I said, "Why have you not been seen in 11 years?" She did not move on the stool. She did not look away. She said, "Because the last person who looked at me made me into someone I did not recognize, and I spent 4 years getting back to the version of myself that had been there before her, and I have not allowed anyone to look at me since, because I did not want to discover that the version I had spent 4 years rebuilding was also someone I would not recognize if I let another person see me." I said, and tonight. She said, tonight I am willing to find out, because the person Vittoria sent me does not flatter. And the only way I can know whether the rebuilt version is real is to be photographed by someone who will not pretend it is something it is not. I said, I see. She said, I expect you do. I lifted the camera again. I took the second frame, the third, the fourth. I worked the way I always worked. I did not ask her to look one way or another. I let her sit on the stool in the deep yellow light of her own private office, while the city went about its life through the windows behind me. And I photographed the woman who had decided, on the basis of a recommendation from Vittoria Carrera, to allow a stranger to see her. I worked for 15 minutes. I did not speak. She did not speak. When I lowered the camera at the end of 15 minutes, she said, "How many frames?" I said, 47. She said, "How many will be usable?" I said, 12, maybe 15. She said, "How many will be the kind I should not see?" I said, 3. She said, "I want to see those 3 first." I said, "I shoot digital and film tonight. The film I will develop tomorrow. The digital I can show you now if you want. I would prefer to develop the film first and choose the 3 from both." She said, "When can you bring me the prints?" I said, "Saturday morning." She said, "Saturday morning is in 2 days." I said, "Yes." She said, "Bring them to my apartment. Not here, not the office, my apartment. I will send you the address tomorrow." I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "That is a different kind of arrangement than what we agreed to tonight." She said, "I know." I said, "I want you to be sure." She said, "I have been sure since I walked into the reception area 26 minutes ago." I said, "I have only been here for 19 minutes. She said, "I know. I was watching the elevator screen at the security desk on my phone. I saw you arrive in the lobby. I knew before you came up that I was sure." I said, "I see." I lowered the camera. I set it on the small side table next to the bottle of water. I crossed the room until I was standing in front of the stool. I was perhaps 3 feet from her. She did not move on the stool. I said, "Stand up." She stood up. She was almost exactly my height, perhaps half an inch taller. The dark suit fell around her with the precision of a thing that had been built by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want to ask you one more question before I leave tonight." She said, "Ask." I said, "When Vittoria called you 3 days ago to tell you my name, what did she say about what would happen if you did this?" She said, "She told me that if I let you photograph me, I would not be the same person on the other side of the photograph. She told me that this was not a warning. She told me it was simply a fact about the kind of work you do. She told me that it was up to me to decide whether the version of myself on the other side of that photograph was a version I was willing to meet." I said, "And?" She said, "I told her that I had been afraid of that version of myself for 11 years, and that I was tired of being afraid." She held my eyes the way she had held the lens, with the steady refusal to look away that I had begun to understand was not aggression in her, but something closer to discipline. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She did not soften. I said, "Saturday morning, your apartment. I will bring the prints." She said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you for tonight." She said, "You have not done anything yet that requires thanks." I said, "You let me into a room that has been locked for 11 years. I am thanking you for the lock." She did not say anything for a moment. Her eyes did the thing eyes do when a sentence has landed somewhere it was not expected to land. The smallest possible change. A person who was not paying attention would not have caught it. I had been paying attention. I had been paying attention since the moment the elevator doors had opened. She said, "Saturday." I said, "Saturday." I packed my equipment. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. She unlocked it without my having to ask. At the door I stopped. I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am going to call Vittoria when I get home." She said, "I know you will." I said, "What would you like me to tell her?" A silence. Then she said, Tell her that I understand now what she meant on the upper terrace. I left. In the elevator down, I stood very still and looked at the small number on the panel descending. I thought about the way Mara Reyes had said, I understand now what she meant on the upper terrace, and what that sentence contained that she had not said out loud. I thought about Vittoria standing on the upper terrace of her villa in the wine-colored dress, on the first night, watching me come up from the lower terraces, and saying in a voice that carried that she had not given me permission to photograph this evening. I thought about Mara saying, I have not been seen in 11 years. I thought about Vittoria saying the same thing to me on the 6th night in the library, with the print of her reading in her hands. I thought about the fact that they had been friends for 15 years, both women who had made themselves invisible for almost the same length of time. Both women who had never once in those years told the other how invisible they had been. I thought about how Vittoria had recommended me, how the recommendation had been not a casual thing, but a deliberate one, how she had made the decision to send a person who had photographed her own private interior to a friend who needed the same kind of work done, how she had done it knowing that I would understand the assignment without being told. I thought about how Vittoria had said in her message, be careful with her. She is more dangerous than I was. I thought about what Vittoria had meant by dangerous. I thought I understood. The elevator opened on the lobby. The 2 security men were still at the desk. The one who had spoken to me when I came in did not speak to me when I left. He did not need to. Whatever the night had contained had been the night that had been planned for. The plan had executed correctly. There was nothing to acknowledge. I walked out into the city. It was October, and the cold had finally started to mean something. I had not brought a heavier coat. I walked the 4 blocks to the metro with my hands in my pockets and my equipment bag on my shoulder, and the specific feeling of having walked out of a room where a thing had begun that was going to be larger than the room had been built to hold. I called Vittoria from the platform. She answered on the 2nd ring. She said, tell me. I said, she told me to tell you that she understands now what you meant on the upper terrace. A silence. I could hear very faintly the sound of the sea behind her wherever she was, which meant she was at the villa. I had not known she was at the villa. I had assumed, without thinking about it, that she had returned to the city. She said, Dahlia. I said, yes. She said, are you going back? I said, Saturday morning, to her apartment, with the prince. She said, I see. I said, Vittoria. She said, yes. I said, why did you send me to her? She said, because she has been my friend for 15 years, and I have watched her be alone for 11 of them. Because 3 weeks ago, I sat with her on my upper terrace, and I understood that she was telling me in the careful way that she tells things, that she was tired. And because I had 3 weeks before that decided, on the basis of an evening I had spent in my own kitchen with a glass of wine, that the thing I had been afraid to do for 11 years was the thing I no longer wanted to be afraid of. I said, and so you sent me to her, so that she could decide the same thing. She said, I sent you to her because I did not want her to spend 11 more years being afraid of a thing I had only spent 3 weeks deciding I was no longer afraid of. I said, Vittoria. She said, yes. I am not in love with her. She said, I know. I said, are you? A long pause. Then she said, I have loved her for 15 years, Dahlia. And I have known for 15 years that she did not love me back, not in that way. So I made the decision, a long time ago, to love her in the way that she could accept being loved, which was as her closest friend. And I have done that. And I will continue to do that. What I want now, what I have wanted for 3 weeks, is for her to be able to be loved by someone she can let love her. And I do not think that person is going to be you. I think that person eventually is going to be someone she meets after you. But she cannot meet that person while she is still locked inside a room she has not opened in 11 years. So I sent her you, to open the room. I said, and me? She said, what about you, Dahlia? I said, where do I go after I open her room? She said, you go where you have always been going. You photograph the next woman, and the one after that. And you continue to do the work you do, which is the work of seeing women who have decided they are tired of not being seen. And one day, when you have done enough of it, you will photograph a woman who you do not leave at the airport on the 8th morning. And that will be the woman you stay with. I said, Vittoria. She said yes. I said, I miss you. She said, I miss you too. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking you to do the work I sent you to do. I said, I will. She said, Saturday morning. I said, Saturday morning. She said, good night, Dahlia. I said, good night, Vittoria. The metro arrived. I got on. I sat down. The carriage was nearly empty. The lights of the tunnel slid past the windows. I thought about the conversation I had just had with Vittoria, about the precision of the way she had said the things she had said, about the fact that she had been carrying for 15 years a feeling that I had watched her allow herself to put down for the first time on the 7th evening in the library, about how her decision to put it down had become 3 weeks later the decision to send me to the woman she had been carrying it for. I thought about Mara Reyes locking the door of her office at 8:34 in the evening. I thought about Mara saying, I have been afraid of that version of myself for 11 years, and I am tired of being afraid. I thought about the fact that there was a version of this story in which Vittoria and Mara had simply been together. And I thought about how that version had been impossible for 15 years, not because of any external thing, but because Mara had not been able to look at herself, and Vittoria had been protecting Mara from the discovery of what she could not look at, by being her closest friend instead of asking her to be more. I went home. I unpacked the equipment. I uploaded the digital frames to my computer for backup. I went into the small darkroom I had built in the second bedroom of my apartment when I had moved in 3 years ago. The darkroom that no one but me had ever used. I worked until almost 2 in the morning. When I finished, I had 47 negatives. I had clipped contact prints of all of them to the small clothesline above the sink. I had made full prints of the 12 I considered usable. 3 of them I had set apart on the small wooden table where I sometimes ate breakfast when I did not want to leave the room. The first of the 3 was the 10th frame I had taken. Mara on the stool, half turned toward the window, her face caught in the moment between 2 thoughts. The thought she had been having, the thought she was about to have. She did not know I had taken the frame at that exact moment. She had thought I was still adjusting the lens. The face in the photograph was the face of a woman who was alone with herself and aware of being alone with herself. The kind of face people did not show photographers because they did not know they had it. The second of the 3 was the 24th frame. Mara looking directly at the lens. The composure, the discipline, the precise non-movement of a face that had been built over 40 years to give nothing away. And underneath it, in the eyes, the small, clear flicker of someone who had decided to give something away and was not yet sure how. The third was the 42nd frame, the second to last I had taken. Mara had turned slightly on the stool to look at the city through the window. The light from the office had caught the line of her jaw and the back of her hair. The frame was almost a profile, almost a back view, almost an architectural photograph of a woman who had decided she was a building, and was inviting me to photograph the building, but not quite. There was a small curve at the corner of her mouth, the smallest possible thing, and the curve said that the building was inhabited, and that the inhabitant had decided in that moment that she did not mind being seen. I looked at the 3 prints for a long time in the dim red light of the darkroom. I understood that Mara had been correct. These were the 3 she should not see. Because they were the three that told the truth about her, and Mara Reyes had spent 11 years not telling the truth about herself. And seeing it in 3 photographs would be the kind of seeing that the rebuilt version of herself would have to either accept as true or rebuild around again. I understood also that Mara had asked to see those 3 first, because she already knew there would be 3 of that kind, and she had wanted, before any of the others, to know whether the rebuilt version was going to have to be rebuild again. I clipped the 3 prints to the line. I went to bed. I did not sleep until almost 4. Friday went past like any Friday goes past when a person is waiting for a Saturday morning. I worked, I ate. I did not call Vittoria. I did not call Mara. At 6:15 in the evening, my phone buzzed. The message was from a number I had not saved. It said only, "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. The address is below." The address was a building in the part of the city where the apartments cost more than houses. I did not know the building, but I recognized the street. The street was the kind of street where the absence of a doorman would have been an oversight. I texted back, "I will be there." She did not reply. I went to bed at midnight. I did not sleep until 3. Saturday morning I was on the street outside the building at 8:47. The building had a doorman. He looked at me with the professional courtesy of his role, and asked who I was visiting. I told him. He said, "Miss Reyes is expecting you. The 40th floor, apartment A. The elevator is on your right." The elevator was small and lined with dark wood. The 40th floor opened onto a single private corridor, with one door at the end of it. The door was open. Mara was standing in it. She was dressed differently than she had been Thursday night. Soft gray trousers, a white shirt unbuttoned at the throat, no jacket, bare feet. Her hair was slightly damp, pushed back from her face, the kind of damp that meant she had showered within the last 20 minutes. She looked younger in the morning than she had looked at night. Or perhaps not younger, less held, the same age, but with the discipline of the suit released into something that had not been required to discipline itself yet. She said, "Come in." I came in. The apartment was a single, very large open space with windows on 3 sides. The light in the morning was clean and cold. There was a low couch, a glass table, a black and white photograph on the only wall that was not glass. The photograph was of a coastline, taken from the air, the kind of photograph that had been chosen rather than collected. The kitchen was at the far end. There was a French press on the counter, and the smell of coffee that had been made in the last 5 minutes. She said, "Coffee." She poured 2 cups. She brought them to the low table. She sat on the couch with her bare feet tucked under her. I sat in the chair across from her. I set the envelope on the table between us. She did not pick it up. She said 3. I said 3. She said, "Show me." I opened the envelope. I took out the 3 prints. I laid them on the table between us, in the order I had taken them. The half-turned frame, the direct frame, the almost profile. She looked at them. She did not pick them up. She looked at them for what was perhaps 4 full minutes. I had stopped counting at 90 seconds, because I understood that counting was a way of managing my own attention, and that I was about to need my attention for something else. When she lifted her eyes from the prints, she lifted them to mine. She said, "These are the 3 you said I should not see." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you let me see them?" I said, "Because you asked." She said, "I did not ask. I told." I said, "I do not work for people who tell me. I work for people who ask. You asked when you said, 'I want to see those 3 first.' You used the word want. I heard it." She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the prints again. She said, "I am the woman in these photographs." I said, "Yes." She said, "I had forgotten." I said, "I know. How did you know I had forgotten?" I said, because Vittoria told me she had forgotten too, until I made her develop the print of her in the wine-colored dress in her own darkroom on the first night. And she stood there, in the red light, and said the photograph was true, and she had not seen a true photograph of herself in 11 years. Mara said, "You have done this before." I said, "Once." She said, "Vittoria." I said, "Vittoria." She said, "I see." I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." I said, "When you saw these 3 prints just now, was the rebuilt version of yourself the version in the photograph?" A long silence. She looked at the prints. She said, "Yes." I said, "Then we are done. The work I came to do is finished." She said, "Are we?" I said, "I came here to bring you these 3 photographs. I have brought them to you. You have looked at them. You have answered the question you came to me to answer. Whatever happens next is not the work. Whatever happens next is something else." She said, "And what is something else, Dahlia?" I said, "Something else is the part of the morning where you and I have to decide separately whether we want to be in a room together that is not about the work." She said, "You have decided." I said, "I have not decided yet. I am asking you to decide first, because I am the one who came here, and you are the one who let me in, and the decision of whether the room is about the work or about something else belongs to the person who is in her own home, in her bare feet, on a Saturday morning." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Vittoria warned me about this part too." I said, "What did she say?" She said, "She told me that you would, at some point, give me the chance to send you home. She told me to take the chance if I wanted. She also told me not to take it if I did not want." I said, "And?" She said, "I am not going to take it." I said, "Mara," I said, "I am going to ask you one more thing, and then I am going to stop talking, because I have been talking for the last 6 weeks, and I am tired of being the one who talks first." She said, "Ask." I said, "What do you want?" She looked at me. She said, "I want you to come over here and sit on this couch." I went. I sat on the couch beside her. Our knees were perhaps 2 inches apart. The morning light came through the eastern windows in the way clean morning light comes through clean windows. The city was doing its Saturday thing, distant and cheerful, and entirely outside the room. She said, "Dahlia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I do not know how to do this part." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "You did it with Vittoria." I said, "I did not do it with Vittoria. I left at dawn on the 8th morning and I have not seen her since. Whatever this part is, it is not a part I have done before." She said, "Then we will both do it for the first time." I said, "Yes." She said, "Would you?" She paused. It was the first time I had heard her struggle with a sentence. She said, "Would you let me put my hand on yours?" I said, "Yes." She put her hand on mine. Her hand was cool from the morning. The skin was the skin of a woman who had not held another person's hand in a way that mattered for a very long time. It was not stiff. It was simply unfamiliar with the geometry. I let it rest on mine for a moment without moving. Then I turned my hand under hers and let her fingers settle into the spaces between mine. The exhale was the same exhale Vittoria had let out on the corner of the street in the city in March. The exhale of a structure given permission to settle. I understood then, in the way certain understandings arrive, that this had been the exhale Vittoria had been waiting 11 years to hear from her closest friend, and that Vittoria had sent me here, knowing the exhale would happen, and knowing that she would not be in the room when it did, and knowing that this was the only way her friend could ever release that breath. I closed my fingers around Mara's. She said, very quietly, "I am not in love with you yet." I said, "I know." She said, "But I am going to be." I said, "You do not know that." She said, "I know that." I said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." I said, Whatever this becomes, it is not going to be tonight, and it is not going to be Saturday morning. It is going to be slow, and we are going to have a great many conversations before either of us decides what it is. Is that what you are asking for? She said, yes. I said, then yes. She said, yes. I leaned forward. I kissed her. Once on the mouth, not deeply. The kiss was the kind of kiss that was a beginning, not a continuation. The kiss was a marker. The kiss said, I am willing. Her free hand came to my jaw, the same way Vittoria's hand had come to my neck on the corner of the street in March. Except it was not the same. It was Mara. Cool fingers, the slight tremor of a person who had not done this since before her body had started to know it had been waiting. She kissed me back the same way I had kissed her. Once. Marker. Beginning. When I pulled back, she was looking at me with the eyes she had been hiding behind composure all of Thursday night, and almost all of Saturday morning. The eyes that were not the CEO eyes. The eyes that were Mara. She said, I want to ask you to stay. I said, I know. She said, I am not going to. I said, Mara. She said, yes. I said, why not? She said, because if you stay this morning, the rest of it will go too fast. And I have been alone for 11 years, and I have not learned yet how to be with another person at the speed I want to be with you. I want to learn it slowly. I want to get this right. I said, then I will leave now. She said, when can you come back? I said, whenever you ask me to. She said, Tuesday. I said, Tuesday. She said, for dinner. I said, for dinner. She said, here. I said, here. We sat on the couch for a while longer. Our hands stayed where they were. We did not say much. The morning continued its slow translation of light across the room. At some point I told her about the apartment in Rome, about the photograph on my wall, about the small darkroom in the second bedroom. She told me about the woman she had been in her 30s, before the 4 years of becoming someone she did not recognize. She told me about her grandmother, who had been from a small town in Galicia, and had taught her to cook 3 things only, and had told her that these 3 things would be enough for any kind of life she chose to have. She made me one of the 3 things in her kitchen at 11 in the morning. It was a kind of egg dish I had never had. It was very simple. It was excellent. When I left at noon, I left with the 3 prints in the envelope, because she asked me to keep them. She said, I do not need them. I have seen them. I know what they are. You take them. I want them somewhere they can be looked at. I said, I will keep them in the small drawer of the desk, where I keep the photograph of Vittoria's foot. She said, 2 photographs in 1 drawer? I said, yes. She said, eventually you will need a bigger drawer. I said, I will deal with that when I have to. She walked me to the door. She kissed me once at the door. She said, Tuesday. I said, Tuesday. I went home. In the elevator down, my phone buzzed. The message was from Vittoria. It said only, and. I typed, and she is going to be all right. 3 minutes. Then, thank you, Dahlia. I went home. I put the 3 prints in the small drawer of the desk, where I had been keeping the photograph of Vittoria's bare foot on the warm stone of the upper terrace. I stood at the window of my apartment in Rome and looked at the small fire escape that I had once been photographed on, without knowing the photograph would become a thing, and I thought about the work that was now waiting for me on Tuesday at 7 in the evening at a building on the 40th floor, where a woman who had not been in love with anyone in 11 years had decided that she was going to be in love with me, slowly, at the speed she needed, with the door unlocked this time. I do not know yet if I am going to fall in love with her back. I think I might. I think I am going to find out, slowly, over a series of Tuesdays. I am going to go back. Tuesday. Then the Tuesday after. Then the one after that. I am going to keep going back until one of us decides it is time to stop. Or until one of us decides the opposite, which is to say that it is time to stop pretending we are still deciding. There is a third photograph in my drawer now. It is the half-turned frame. The one where Mara was caught in the moment between two thoughts, alone with herself in her own private office, in a room that had been locked for 11 years and was now, very quietly, no longer locked. The other two prints I kept too, in a separate envelope, not to look at, just to have, because Mara had asked me to keep them somewhere where they could be looked at. And in the apartment in Rome, in the small drawer of the desk, beside the photograph of a foot on warm stone, there was no place where photographs could not be looked at. Vittoria sent me a text on Sunday morning. It said only, "The villa is empty in November. If you need a quiet place to think, the room you stayed in is yours." I typed back, "Thank you. I am all right in Rome." She typed, "I know. The offer stands anyway." I closed the phone. I stood at the window. The fire escape was the fire escape. The October light in Rome was the October light in Rome. Somewhere in another city, a woman with very dark short hair was standing in her apartment in her bare feet, trying not to think about Tuesday too much. Somewhere in Capri, another woman in a butter yellow library was holding a single photograph of a woman reading, and was perhaps, very quietly, smiling at the work that had been done. If you want to hear what happened on the 7th Tuesday, what Mara asked me to photograph in the bedroom that no one had been allowed into for 11 years, what Vittoria said when I called her from a hotel room in March, on the night before something I cannot tell you about here, that's on my Patreon. Day by day, week by week. Step into the darkroom. The link is in the description below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Good night.